As we continue on our discussion of compensating wage differentials, in this segment we're going to think about employer considerations. We've thought about the employee's indifference curve, or a graphic representation of the utility that employees might get in wage and risk space and wage and benefit space. But what about the employer's considerations? Because they also can be modeled in this wage and risk or wage and benefit space. Well, the employer's considerations are going to have to do with the wages they're paying the workers, going to have to do with the productivity of the workers. Higher productivity means higher profits, or maybe might mean that they have to pay a worker a higher wage to get a more productive worker. The employer's considerations are going to include, are they having to train these workers? Training comes at a cost. What benefits do they deliver to the workers? Health insurance, vacation pay, sick leave, retirement, etc. These come at a cost. Some of these costs might be borne by the worker, but some of these costs might also then be borne by the employer. And so what does this do to the employer's bottom line? These are all costs in the worker environment. We have to think about the safety level that an employer is going to sponsor. We might not overtly consider this, but employers really can make a choice. Employers could choose to pay a higher wage and spend less money on risk remediation within their firm. Or maybe they will choose to pay a lower wage and spend a lot of money on risk remediation. They'd rather have a safe environment with lower paid employees that are very risk averse than an environment that's maybe not as safe and where they have to pay a higher wage. They're going to pay one way or the other. They're either going to pay for the risk remediation or they're going to pay for wages. Just like when we were thinking about indifference curves for the employee, we can think about something referred to as an isoprofit curve for the employer. Another term for an indifference curve would be an ISO utility curve. ISO simply meaning that we have a constant level of something at every point on that curve. So an isoprofit curve, or the employer's indifference curve, really just measures what utility the employer is really trying to get, and let's face it, the utility that a firm seeks to obtain is profit. So this is nothing but an indifference curve for a firm. We call them isoprofit curves because on an isoprofit curve, a profit level is constant at any point on the curve. And it's reflective of a combination, when we're in wage and risk space, of the different costs that we might have associated. We're either spending money in wages or we're spending money in risk remediation, etc. And we can think of the price of the risk, or risk remediation perhaps, divided by the wage as some marginal rate of substitution. So as we go along that curve, we're substituting risk for wage, and that the curve is informed by this marginal rate of substitution, which is the price of risk divided by the price of wage. And in this case, we're going to be thinking about it, given that it is a wage and risk space, we'll think about it as being upward sloping. We'll model this in just a moment. So let's think about this. In wage and risk space, just like the employee's indifference curve was upward sloping, we have the employer's indifference, or isoprofit curve, is upward sloping, but in this case there's almost certainly a concave form to it. And on the isoprofit curve, we know that we have the same level of profit at every point on the curve. So this might be an isoprofit curve, or an isoprofit of profit zero, whereas a higher isoprofit curve would have a different level of profit. So let's think about this. If I have this higher isoprofit curve, what I'm suggesting is that for the same level of risk that I have a higher wage. Well, if that's true, a higher wage is going to yield less profits. So this might be isoprofit of less than zero, whereas an isoprofit curve that would be lower than the isoprofit where profit was zero would perhaps be an isoprofit curve where the profit is greater than zero, because for the same level of risk or the same cost of risk remediation, we're able to pay a lower level of wage. We're often going to be thinking about this in terms of a competitive market environment. So the default isoprofit curve that we'll be thinking about will include the zero profit condition. Recall that in microeconomics, we expect that profits are zero when markets are competitive or when they equilibrate. And we know that because if there is profit in a market, we know that there will be competitors entering that market, and the presence of competition will drive down prices. And assuming that costs remain constant, then a lower price means lesser profit. So if we think about this further, we can also consider what it might look like in wage and benefit space. So let's go to wage and benefit space, and I've drawn this isoprofit curve, or isoprofit 0 in this case, because that's the default position, and I've drawn it as a downward sloping straight line. Well, this really looks strangely like a budget. We might not have thought about these isoprofit curves in wage and risk space as budgets, but in fact, these are simply budgets. On this budget curve, the employer can pay wages or the employer can pay to remediate risk. On this curve, the employer can pay wages or the employer can pay for additional benefits. So when an employer has a profit margin of zero, then they have some cost that they can attribute to wages and benefits and maintain that zero profit. And that would be downward sloping. You might even think about this often as downward sloping and concave, but we can simply think about it in a straight line or a concave form, either one. But this is, once again, just the employer's isoprofit curve, because at any point on this curve, we have the same level of profit. And if we're wanting to think about an isoprofit curve that has a different level of profit, well, let's think about this. If it is this form, so we now have a different isoprofit curve. I'm using the symbol pi to evidence profit here. Well, for the same level of benefits, I apparently am paying a higher wage than I was here or here. So this is going to be a profit where it's less than zero. Whereas if I have a isoprofit curve that is inside of this space, inside of the initial curve, then, well, that wouldn't be a very good one because it's touching the other curve. Let me say the isoprofit curve that looked like this, isoprofit. That's going to be an isoprofit of greater than zero because I have a lower wage for the same level of benefits. And that's probably the easiest way to think about this. So just as workers have indifference curves, firms have isoprofit curves. And you might suppose that is in this wage and benefit space where the worker's indifference curve is going to be downward sloping and convex, that a worker and a firm will choose to align with each other, or they'll match, or the firm will choose to hire the worker when the worker's indifference curve matches or is tangent to the firm's isoprofit curve. So this would be the worker's indifference curve. So this would suggest that at this combination of wages and benefits, this worker is willing to accept this job, and this firm is going to be at a zero profit condition.